This all started about 2 years ago, give or take a few months. I was living in Chicago, working a regular 9-to-5 job downtown, doing what most people do. Commuting, eating lunch at the same deli, going home to relax, and watching Netflix before bed. Life was pretty routine, boring even. But that's exactly why it all caught me off guard so much. One night I was up late, browsing the internet. It was one of those nights where you lose track of time and end up clicking on random links until you wind up in a dark corner of the internet. I don't even remember what I started looking for, but I ended up on a forum that felt off. It wasn't one of those generic message boards or even one of the conspiracy theory sites you hear about. It felt way darker, like the people here were into things you don't even want to think about. I should have just closed the tab and gone to bed, but I was curious. I started reading through the posts. Some of it was typical stuff, complaints about the government, rants about society. But there were other posts, ones that suggested something more sinister was going on. People talked about completing tasks and getting paid for them, but the details were vague. What freaked me out the most was how casually they discussed things like tracking marks, delivering packages, and scouting. The more I read, the more I realized these weren't just random internet trolls. This was organized. That's when I saw it. My name. There it was, plain as day, in one of the threads. At first I thought it was a coincidence. There are plenty of people with my name, right? But then I noticed the details. It wasn't just my name. They had my job, my neighborhood, even the make and model of my car. I felt my stomach drop. It was like being punched in the gut. I scrolled through the post, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all the details were there. It was about me. The post was part of some kind of bidding process. They were talking about me like I was a project, like something they were working on. People were commenting on it, discussing ways to gather information on me. Someone had posted a picture of my office building, taken from the street. Someone else had posted a shot of me walking down the sidewalk near my apartment. I hadn't even noticed anyone taking the pictures. I felt sick, like the world was caving in around me. I remember sitting there in my dark living room, staring at the screen, unable to move for what felt like hours. My brain was racing, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. I didn't have any enemies, no debts, no crazy exes. So why was this happening? Who the hell were these people? I did the only thing I could think of. I logged off, closed the laptop, and tried to forget about it. Maybe it was some kind of sick joke. I convinced myself that it had to be, but of course it wasn't that simple. The next morning, things started to feel different. On my way to work, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. Everything and everyone seemed suspicious. Was that guy on the train looking at me? Was the woman at the coffee shop acting strange? The rational part of my brain tried to tell me that it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I felt paranoid, constantly on edge. A week went by and I tried to get back to normal. But then, weird things started happening. Little things at first. My mail seemed to be out of order, like someone had been going through it. Packages I hadn't ordered showed up at my door, mostly junk that I'd never even heard of. My phone started glitching, calls dropping randomly, strange static in the background, even though I had good service. I tried to tell myself that it was all just a coincidence, but then the bigger stuff started happening. One night I came home from work, and my apartment door was unlocked. I know for a fact that I had locked it when I left. I felt my heart racing as I opened the door and walked inside. Nothing looked out of place, but I had that feeling like someone had been there, I checked all the rooms, but everything seemed normal. Still, I changed the locks the next day. I figured maybe I was just overreacting, that I was letting paranoia get the better of me, but I couldn't shake it. I kept thinking about that post. The details were too specific for it to be a prank. Someone had to be following me. But why? I decided to stay off the internet for a while, to disconnect and try to regain some sense of normalcy. I didn't talk to anyone about what was happening. I didn't want to sound like a crazy person. Instead, I tried to focus on work, to keep my head down and ignore the growing sense of dread that was following me around like a shadow. Then one day I got an email. No subject, no message, just an attachment. Against my better judgment, I opened it. It was a photo of me. Walking to work wearing my usual coat, head down, looking at my phone. It wasn't a photo I recognized. Someone else had taken it. My heart started pounding in my chest. There was no name, no signature, nothing. Just the photo. I felt like I was going to be sick. From that point on, everything spiraled. Every day, there was something new. Another photo. A weird package. Random people knocking on my door, asking for someone who didn't live there. Once I got a delivery of a pizza I hadn't ordered. The delivery guy said someone had paid in advance, online. I never found out who it was. At work, I started noticing strange cars parked outside my building. I'd see the same one over and over again in different spots. On the street, in the parking garage, outside the coffee shop I always went to. I never saw who was driving it, but it was always there. Black, tinted windows, nondescript. I started taking different routes to work, trying to lose the feeling of being followed, but it didn't help. The car was always there. One night I got home late. It had been a long day at work and I was exhausted. As I walked up to my building, I noticed something odd. The streetlight near my building was flickering, which wasn't unusual in itself. City lights go out all the time. But as I got closer, I realized that it wasn't just flickering randomly. It was timed, like someone was turning it on and off deliberately. I stopped walking, just standing there on the sidewalk, staring up at the light. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I decided to just ignore it and go inside. That was a mistake. When I got inside my apartment, I noticed something was off. It was subtle at first. Small things out of place, like my shoes weren't where I'd left them, or the books on my coffee table had been rearranged. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining it, but the more I looked around, the more I realized that someone had been inside. Again, I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in my living room, every light on, staring at the front door, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but that didn't make me feel any better. The next day, I went to the police. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. I reported the break-ins, the packages, the strange emails. They took my statement, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. They asked if I had any enemies or if anyone had threatened me recently. I told them no, which was the truth. I hadn't had any real confrontations with anyone, at least not that I was aware of. The police said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. I felt helpless. I didn't know who was after me or why, and the people who were supposed to help me didn't seem to care. Things kept getting worse. I started receiving letters in the mail, handwritten, with no return address. They weren't threatening exactly, but they were weird. Random phrases like, "I see you," "You're next," and "Watch your back" scribbled on pieces of paper. Sometimes they were just blank sheets. Other times they had photos of me attached. I was terrified. I couldn't concentrate at work. I couldn't sleep. I started losing weight because I couldn't eat. Every noise in my apartment made me jump. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, checking my phone for weird messages, scanning every car that drove by to see if it was following me. It was driving me insane. I decided to move. I couldn't take it anymore. I found a place in a different part of town. Nothing fancy, just a small apartment in a quieter neighborhood. I hoped that by moving, I could get away from whoever was doing this to me. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. I didn't tell anyone where I was moving, not even my coworkers. I made the switch as quietly as possible, packed up all my stuff, and got out of there. For a while, it seemed like things were getting better. No more strange packages, no more emails, no more creepy cars parked outside my building. I started to relax, just a little bit. But then, it started again. One morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was just one word: found. That was all it said, but it was enough to send me spiraling all over again. How did they find me? I had been so careful. I thought I had left it all behind, but somehow they had tracked me down. The paranoia came flooding back. Every time I walked down the street, I felt like someone was watching me. I started checking my phone constantly, looking for any signs of hacking or tracking, but I couldn't find anything. It was like they were ghosts, always one step ahead of me. I don't know how long I can keep living like this. I've thought about leaving the city, maybe going somewhere remote where no one can find me. But I know it's probably too late for that. This whole thing started about 1.5 years ago. I live in Boston, not far from the city center, but in one of those quieter neighborhoods where most of the buildings are apartment complexes or older townhouses. It was around the time when COVID restrictions were easing up, and I was spending more time online, probably like everyone else. I don't even remember how it happened exactly, but one night, I fell into a rabbit hole on the internet. It started with some YouTube videos about hacking and privacy, which led me to articles about the dark web. I knew the dark web existed, of course, but I'd never really looked into it. Out of curiosity, I did some more research, clicked through a few links, probably not the smartest thing, and ended up on this site that was selling surveillance footage. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was kind of like those videos people post on YouTube from security cameras, people falling down stairs, package thieves getting caught, that sort of thing. But the more I scrolled, the weirder it got. These weren't just random clips. This site was offering live access to hacked cameras, everything from office buildings and warehouses to apartments and homes. They were advertising it like a service, where you could pay to watch live feeds from anywhere in the world. You could even request specific cameras if you knew the address or had the coordinates. It creeped me out, so I closed the tab and went back to watching Netflix. I figured it was just one of those sketchy corners of the internet that I'd stumbled across by accident. About a week later, I was sitting at my desk in my apartment, working from home, when I got a notification on my phone. It was an email from an address I didn't recognize, but the subject line caught my attention. It just said FYI, which was weirdly vague. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email was short. Just a link and nothing else. I don't know what possessed me to click on it, but I did. It took me to that same surveillance site I'd found before. Only this time, instead of a general homepage with random cameras, it opened directly to a live feed. At first, I didn't recognize what I was looking at. It was a black and white video, grainy and low quality, like it was from an old security camera. It showed a street, some parked cars, a few trees. It looked like any random street in the city, so I didn't think much of it. But as I kept watching, something started to feel off. The angle of the camera, the way the buildings were positioned, it looked familiar, too familiar. Then it hit me. It was my street. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The camera was pointed directly at my building, my apartment. I could see the front door, the steps leading up to it, the small patch of grass near the entrance where someone had left their bike chained to the railing. I recognized everything. I didn't know what to do. I refreshed the page, hoping it was just some random glitch or coincidence, but the feed stayed the same. This wasn't just some random camera, it was showing my street. My first thought was that maybe the building's security cameras had been hacked. But I'd never seen any cameras outside. And this didn't look like footage from a professional setup. It looked like it was coming from someone's home system, like one of those cheap cameras you buy online to stick in a window or something. I started feeling uneasy, so I closed the site again. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself. Just some weird overlap. Maybe the street just looked like mine. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying the image of that feed in my mind, trying to convince myself that it wasn't my street, that I was just being paranoid. But something wasn't sitting right. That night, I did a little more digging, trying to figure out what the deal was with that site. There wasn't much info out there, but I found a few forums where people talked about similar things. Hacked cameras, live feeds being sold to anonymous buyers. It was all pretty vague, and most people didn't seem to know much more than I did. But it was enough to make me worry. A few nights later, I got another email. Same sender, no subject, just another link. This time, I hesitated. My gut was telling me not to click it, but curiosity got the better of me again. I clicked the link, and it took me to another live feed. This one wasn't showing the street, though. It was showing the inside of an apartment, my apartment. I froze. The camera was pointed right at my living room window. It was the same black and white footage, grainy and staticky, but I could clearly make out the inside of my apartment. The camera was high up, like it was stuck to the outside of the building, facing down through the window. I could see my couch, the coffee table, even the edge of my desk where I'd been sitting earlier that day. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I was going to pass out. I immediately jumped up and ran to the window. I couldn't see anything. No cameras, no strange devices, nothing. I even opened the window and leaned out, looking around the edges, but there was nothing there. But the feed was still live, and it was clearly coming from somewhere nearby. I didn't sleep that night. I kept checking every corner of my apartment, trying to figure out how someone had gotten a camera pointed inside. I pulled the curtains closed, double-checked the locks, even put some tape over the peephole just in case. But none of it made me feel better. Whoever had set up that camera, they knew exactly what they were doing. Over the next few days, things escalated. I got more emails, all with links to live feeds. Some of them showed the inside of my building's stairwell, others showed the lobby, the mailboxes, the hallway outside my door. Whoever was doing this, they were getting closer, and they were watching every move I made. I stopped opening the emails, but they kept coming, and I couldn't help but check the links every now and then, just to see if anything had changed. And it had. The cameras were moving. They were tracking me. Every time I went outside, every time I came back home, there was a new angle, a new perspective. It was like they were adjusting the cameras based on where I'd been, making sure they never lost sight of me. I tried going to the building management, but they were no help. They said they didn't have any security cameras installed, and when I asked about anyone else in the building installing their own, they just shrugged and said it wasn't their problem. I called the police, but they didn't take me seriously either. They said it was probably just a prank or a misunderstanding, and they didn't have the resources to investigate something like this unless there was a direct threat. I felt helpless. One night I decided to go for a walk, just to clear my head. I couldn't stand being in the apartment anymore, knowing that someone could be watching me. I walked down to the nearby park, trying to distract myself, but my mind kept racing. When I got back, I checked my phone, another email. This one was different, though. No link, no subject, just a single sentence. "You look good in red." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. That day I'd worn a red jacket. I hadn't been wearing it inside, but I had worn it on my walk. Whoever was doing this had been watching me the whole time. After that, things got worse. It wasn't just emails anymore. I started getting packages delivered to my apartment, random things I hadn't ordered. Sometimes it was cheap junk like plastic toys or kitchen utensils. Other times it was weirder stuff, like a box of old VHS tapes, a broken radio, or a pack of expired batteries. There was never a return address, and when I asked the delivery companies, they couldn't tell me where the packages had come from. It felt like a game, like whoever was behind this was trying to mess with my head, slowly driving me insane. I started avoiding my apartment as much as possible. I'd stay out late, crashing at a friend's place or at a hotel whenever I could afford it. But every time I came back, there was something new waiting for me. A new email, a new package, a new camera angle on the live feed. It was relentless. I even tried turning off all the lights and sitting in complete darkness, hoping that if I didn't move, they wouldn't be able to track me. But it didn't matter. The cameras always found me. Every time I checked the feed, they were still there, still watching. I became obsessed with trying to find the cameras. I tore my apartment apart, looking behind every piece of furniture, inside every vent, every nook and cranny where a camera could possibly be hidden. But I never found anything. It was like they were invisible, like they didn't exist. But the feed was proof that they were there. One day, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to avoid the cameras, I'd confront them. I pulled out my phone and opened the latest email. The link led to a live feed of my living room again. I sat down on the couch, staring straight into the camera, waiting. I don't know what I was expecting to happen. Maybe that whoever was watching would stop, maybe they'd show themselves. But nothing happened. The feed just kept running, the same grainy black and white image of me sitting there on the couch. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't leave a note or anything. I just got in my car and drove. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get away to clear my head. I ended up at a motel a few towns over, far enough from the city that I felt like I was finally off the grid. But even there, I couldn't escape it. When I checked my email the next morning, there was a new message waiting for me. No subject, no message, just a link. My heart was pounding as I clicked on it, knowing what I'd find. The feed loaded, and there it was, my motel room, the same black and white footage, the same grainy quality. The camera was pointed directly at the window, capturing everything inside. It didn't matter how far I ran or where I went. They always found me. That was the last straw. I left my phone at the motel, packed my things, and drove back to the city. I knew there was no escaping it, no outrunning whatever was happening to me. I went back to my apartment, back to the cameras, back to the emails. I didn't know what else to do. Now I barely leave my apartment. I've quit my job, cut off most of my friends, and spend most of my time just sitting here, waiting. I need to start by saying I was always the kind of person who liked to dig into strange corners of the internet. It's not that I was looking for anything weird or illegal. I was just curious. I'd spend hours reading about conspiracy theories, exploring obscure forums, looking up old declassified documents, stuff like that. It was like a hobby for me. I didn't think anything of it. I should have known better. I live in Seattle, and I've been here for a few years. My life's pretty average. I work as a data analyst at a small firm. Nothing exciting. The job's fine, the pay's okay, and I spend most of my free time online or reading. I've always been interested in medical research, especially the kind of stuff that never makes it to the mainstream. I'm talking about underground studies, experimental procedures that are still in the testing phase, that kind of thing. The darker the better. It's just something that fascinated me, even though I knew most of what I read was probably exaggerated or fake. So, one night about a year ago, I stumbled onto this forum. I don't even remember how I found it. It was one of those nights where you're just clicking through links without paying much attention. But this forum was different. The people there weren't just discussing medical research in the usual way. They were talking about stuff that wasn't even remotely legal. I'm talking about human experiments, the kind of things you hear about in urban legends or horror movies. But the way they discussed it was clinical, almost detached. Like they were just sharing tips about the latest technology or discussing the results of some new trial drug. The posts were full of jargon that I had to Google to understand, and the more I read, the more I felt like I was falling into a rabbit hole. People were talking about live experiments being run on actual humans. Not in some controlled lab with protocols, but in basements and warehouses with kidnapped subjects. They talked about paying to watch these experiments through live streams, or even to volunteer as observers, to record data for the people running the tests. I couldn't believe what I was reading at first. It sounded too crazy to be real, like some kind of dark web hoax. But the more I read, the more detailed it became. People were describing procedures that matched up with real, if controversial, medical research. Organ harvesting, neurological experiments, forced drug trials. Things that were right on the fringes of what might be possible, but no one sane would actually attempt. At least that's what I thought. I lurked on that forum for a few days, just reading. I didn't participate, didn't comment or ask questions, but I started noticing patterns. Some of the posts would mention cities, real places where these supposed experiments were happening. A few mentioned Seattle. I thought it was probably just a coincidence, but then I saw a post that talked about a facility just outside the city. It mentioned the name of a town that was only about an hour's drive from where I lived. That's when I started getting really curious. The thing is, I have this bad habit of pushing things too far when I get interested in something. It's like I need to know more, even when I know I should just stop. So, I started looking up the town they mentioned. It wasn't a big place, just some small industrial town that no one really talks about. But I found out there were a few abandoned warehouses there, and one of them matched the vague description in the post. It was like a light bulb went off in my head. It was real. These people weren't just talking, they were actually doing this stuff. I kept following the forum. The posts didn't come often, but when they did, I read every word. People would talk about watching live feeds of the experiments, about the effects of whatever drugs or procedures were being tested on the subjects. It was disturbing, but I couldn't stop reading. I was like an addict, waiting for the next hit of information. Then one night I got a message. It was from one of the users on the forum, someone I hadn't interacted with at all. The message was short, just a link, and a few words telling me to check it out. I hesitated. I wasn't stupid, I knew this was getting way out of hand. But my curiosity got the better of me, as it always did. I clicked the link. It took me to a live feed, just like the ones people had been talking about on the forum. At first, the screen was black, just a timestamp in the corner. Then the image flickered, and I saw what looked like a dimly lit room. The camera was pointed down at some kind of table, and there was someone lying on it. They were strapped down, and I could see tubes and wires running from their body to machines in the background. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but I could see their chest rising and falling, so I knew they were alive. I don't know how long I watched, but it felt like forever. Nothing happened for a while, just this person lying there, breathing. Then someone stepped into the frame. They were wearing a mask, a surgical mask and gloves, and they started adjusting the tubes and wires. I could hear faint noises through the feed, machines beeping, the clatter of metal tools. The person on the table didn't move, didn't make a sound. Suddenly, the screen went black again. The feed had cut out. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. It looked real, too real. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just some sick fantasy being played out on a forum. This was happening. Right now. Somewhere near me. I tried to close the browser, tried to shut it down and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. My mind was racing. What if this was happening in that warehouse? What if these people had been operating right under my nose the whole time? I started to panic, but I couldn't let it go. Over the next few days, I kept checking the forum, hoping to find more information, something that would make sense of what I'd seen. And then a new post appeared. It was from the same user who had sent me the link. They were asking for volunteers, people to watch the live feeds and take notes to help record the data for the people running the experiments. They were offering money. Not a lot, but enough to make it tempting. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should walk away, but I couldn't. It was like something had snapped inside me. I convinced myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't the one running the experiments. I was just observing, just collecting data. That's how I justified it to myself anyway. So I signed up. I created a burner account and messaged the user back, saying I was interested. Within a few hours, I got a reply. They gave me access to a private section of the forum where the live feeds were posted. There were a few other users in there too. People like me, curious, fascinated, maybe a little too eager to see what was going on behind the scenes. For the next few weeks, I watched. Every night, I'd log in and take notes on the live feeds. The experiments were brutal. The people they used as subjects, whoever they weren't there voluntarily. You could see it in their eyes, in the way they flinched and struggled whenever someone came near them. They were being pumped full of drugs, having parts of their bodies cut open, wires inserted into their brains, all kinds of things that I could barely understand. And yet, I kept watching. I don't know why. Maybe it was the same morbid curiosity that had led me to the forum in the first place. Maybe it was the feeling of power that came from being a part of something so secret, so dangerous. Or maybe I had just lost my sense of right and wrong. I don't know. One night something changed. I logged in as usual, ready to take notes, but the feed was different. The camera was in a new location, another room, one I hadn't seen before. It was smaller, more cramped, with bare walls and a single chair in the center. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. The room was empty, but then the door opened, and two men walked in. They were dragging someone with them, someone whose hands were tied behind their back and a bag over their head. My stomach turned as I watched them shove the person into the chair and pull the bag off their head. It was a man middle-aged with dark hair and a bruised face. He looked terrified. They started talking to him, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. The sound on the feed was too low, just faint murmurs and the occasional loud thud as one of the men hit the chair or banged on the table nearby. I kept watching, waiting for something to happen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then the man in the chair looked up at the camera. For a split second, our eyes met, through the screen, through the feed, and I felt like he was staring right at me. That's when I recognized him. It took me a minute to place it, but then it clicked. This man had been on the news. He was a local guy, someone who had gone missing a few weeks earlier. They'd found his car abandoned in a parking lot near the downtown area, but there were no leads, no evidence of foul play. The news anchors had said he might have just left on his own, that maybe it was a case of voluntary disappearance. But I knew better. He hadn't left on his own. He'd been taken. And now he was here, in this room, about to be experimented on like all the others. I felt sick. I wanted to stop watching, to close the feed and forget about everything. But I couldn't. I was in too deep. I had become a part of this, whether I liked it or not. For the next hour, I watched as they strapped the man down to a table and began their procedure. I won't go into details, but it was worse than anything I'd seen before. They didn't just pump him full of drugs or attach wires to his head. They cut him open, piece by piece, like they were dissecting an animal. And the whole time, he was awake, screaming, begging for them to stop. I had to mute the sound just to keep from throwing up. When it was over, they left the room, leaving his body on the table like it was nothing. The feed stayed on for a while longer, showing the aftermath. I couldn't take it anymore. I closed the browser and shut off my computer. I haven't logged back in since. The forum still exists, and I'm sure the experiments are still happening. But I can't be a part of it anymore. It all started a little over a year ago. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I work in IT. Just your average job, nothing glamorous. I handle network security for a few small businesses. It's a decent living, and I've always been pretty tech-savvy, so it works for me. I spend a lot of time online, sometimes for work, and sometimes just out of boredom. I guess that's how I ended up where I did, on that site. At first, I wasn't looking for anything specific. I'd been going through a phase where I'd watch a lot of dark content, like true crime documentaries, disturbing short films, that kind of thing. I always thought it was fascinating how twisted people could be. But then I found this forum, a place buried deep in the darker corners of the web. It wasn't easy to find, and I probably wouldn't have even known about it if it hadn't been mentioned in passing on some obscure subreddit. It looked like any other anonymous forum, but the topics were different. There were no arguments about politics or pop culture. Instead, people were talking about much darker stuff, things that were clearly illegal. Most of it seemed to be people trading files, nothing too crazy at first. Just data dumps and stuff. But then I saw a thread about live streams, and that's when things started to get weird. People were talking about watching real-time streams of all sorts of disturbing things. Some of the more extreme ones I figured had to be fakes. I assumed it was all just for shock value, like a form of extreme internet trolling. It couldn't possibly be real, right? But my curiosity got the better of me, as it always does. I ended up clicking on one of the links to a stream. It took me to this sketchy website that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Terrible design, flashing ads everywhere, nothing professional about it. There was a live chat on the side, and the stream was embedded in the middle of the page. At first, the stream showed nothing but a blank room, dimly lit, with some kind of metal table in the center. I thought it was probably just a looped video or something. But people in the chat were active, talking about what was going to happen. Some of them were even placing bets on what they wanted to see. I should have closed the tab. I knew I should have, but I didn't. About 5 minutes in, a person was dragged into the room by 2 masked men. The person was struggling, but their arms and legs were tied, so it didn't do them much good. They were placed on the table, and the camera zoomed in closer. The chat exploded with comments. People were typing things like, "Make it slow," and "break their fingers first." I felt a pit in my stomach. This was no longer some abstract idea or fake video. This was happening live, and these people were paying to watch it. I couldn't look away. It was like a train wreck, horrible but somehow impossible not to watch. I won't go into too many details, but it became clear very quickly what the site was about. The people on the other end weren't just watching for entertainment. They were controlling the situation. The chat was filled with commands, people suggesting what should be done to the person on the table. And then the worst part. The people running the stream were following the suggestions. They were actually doing what the chat was asking. It wasn't fast or chaotic either. It was methodical, like they had done it 100 times before. I felt sick. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I couldn't bring myself to close the browser either. I kept telling myself that maybe it was staged, maybe it was just a sick, elaborate performance. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was too raw, too real. The person on the table wasn't acting. Their fear was palpable through the screen. I closed the site after about 15 minutes. It was too much. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that room, that table, and the look on that person's face. I tried to tell myself it was a one-time thing, that I'd stumbled onto something dark by accident, and that was the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mind kept drifting back to the stream, to the people in the chat. Who were they? What kind of people pay for that? I couldn't wrap my head around it. I spent most of the day at work in a haze, just going through the motions without really paying attention. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, but I couldn't relax. I ended up back online, searching for more information about the site, trying to find out if anyone else knew about it or had reported it. I found nothing. It was like the site didn't exist outside of that one hidden forum. A few days later, I got an email. It was from an address I didn't recognize, just a string of random characters. The subject line was blank, and the body of the email contained only one sentence. "We saw you watching." I felt my blood run cold. I didn't know what to do. I thought about replying, but something told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I deleted the email and tried to put it out of my mind. But I couldn't. Over the next few weeks, I started getting more emails. They all came from different addresses, but the messages were similar. Short, cryptic sentences like, "We know who you are," and "Don't look away." I blocked the senders, but the emails kept coming from new addresses. It was clear that whoever was sending them wasn't going to stop. They wanted me to know that they were watching me, just like I had watched that stream. Then the packages started arriving. It began with small things, random junk that I hadn't ordered, like cheap trinkets, plastic toys, or random household items. There was no return address on any of them, just my name and my address. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe a mix-up with some online orders, but the packages kept coming. And the items inside started getting stranger. One day, I got a box filled with nothing but shredded paper. Another time, it was a single torn-up shoe, dirty and covered in what looked like dried mud. I couldn't make sense of it. Who was sending me this stuff? Why? I called the police once, after I got a particularly unsettling package. It was a small cardboard box, and when I opened it, there was nothing inside but a single Polaroid photo. The photo was of my apartment building, taken from the street. It was a little blurry, but you could clearly see my window on the 4th floor. The timestamp on the photo was from the previous night. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Someone had been outside my apartment watching me, taking pictures. The police didn't seem too concerned. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. They suggested it might be a prank, maybe a case of mistaken identity. They said they'd look into it, but didn't make any promises. I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whoever was doing this was too careful. I decided to change all my passwords, get a new phone number, and tighten up my online security. I even went so far as to install a few extra locks on my door and a security camera in the hallway outside my apartment. But none of it helped. The emails and packages kept coming, and the messages became more threatening. One of the last emails I got simply said, "You're next." At that point, I was barely sleeping. Every noise in my apartment made me jump, and I couldn't stop checking the camera feed from the hallway. I kept telling myself that it was all just some sick game, that whoever was behind this was just trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. They weren't just trying to scare me, they were preparing me for something. One night, I came home late from work. It had been a long day and I was exhausted. I just wanted to crash on the couch and forget about everything. But as soon as I walked into my apartment, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, like someone had been there. I checked all the rooms, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, hoping to distract myself with some mindless browsing. That's when I noticed the stream was open again. I hadn't clicked on it, hadn't even visited the site in weeks, but there it was playing in the background on my screen. My heart dropped. It was the same room, the same dimly lit table. But this time, the room wasn't empty. There was someone sitting on the table, their back to the camera. They were tied up, just like the person I had seen before. But something about them seemed familiar. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen, trying to make out more details. And then it hit me. The person on the table was wearing the same clothes I had worn earlier that day. The same jacket, the same jeans, even the same shoes. My mind was racing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But as the camera zoomed in, I saw the side of their face. Just for a second, it was me. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking. I couldn't process what I had just seen. How could it be me? I was sitting here in my apartment, alive and well. But the person on that table, it was like looking at a reflection, a twisted, distorted reflection of myself. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even turn the lights off. I just sat there, staring at the locked door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next day, I called out of work and spent the whole day trying to figure out what to do. I thought about going to the police again, but what would I tell them? That I saw myself on a live stream being tortured. They'd think I was insane. Hell, I was starting to think I was insane. But deep down, I knew it was real. That stream, those emails, those packages, it was all leading to something. They were trying to get to me, to break me down, and it was working. A few days later, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I froze. I knew I had locked it when I left that morning. My stomach churned as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment looked normal, nothing out of place, but I knew someone had been there. I could feel it. I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and checked the security camera feed from the hallway. Sure enough, there was footage of someone standing outside my door earlier that day. They were wearing a hood, their face obscured, but they had been there for at least 10 minutes before finally stepping inside. I packed a bag and left that night. I haven't been back since. A few years ago, I did something incredibly stupid and it ruined my life. It still haunts me every day. And even though I try to ignore it, there are times when it all comes rushing back and the fear grips me all over again. I was in my last year of studying sociology. For those who don't know, sociology students are always digging around in weird corners of the internet, trying to find stuff to research or analyze. I was particularly into the psychology of fear and paranoia, fascinated by how people behave when they feel like they're under surveillance. I thought it would make a great topic for my thesis, something unique, maybe even groundbreaking. During my endless searches online, I came across a forum on the dark web. I won't name the site, for obvious reasons, but it advertised social experiments that people could volunteer for. The promise was simple. They would monitor how you react to stress, anxiety, and fear in real-life situations. In exchange, they would pay you a significant sum of money, way more than what I would normally make from part-time gigs as a student. I didn't think much of it, to be honest. At the time, it seemed like a strange but manageable experiment, one that might actually help with my research. I was curious about how they would measure fear and thought. Maybe they'd give me some kind of psychological evaluation or maybe some harmless tests. I signed up. After submitting some basic details, my name, address, and phone number, I was asked to consent to being monitored for a period of time. The instructions were vague. They mentioned something about surveillance and stress testing, but didn't go into specifics. I assumed they might watch me through my social media or track my browsing habits. As someone who spent a lot of time online anyway, I didn't think much of it. For the first few days, nothing unusual happened. I went about my daily routine, attending classes, grabbing coffee at my favorite spot near campus, and working on my thesis at the library. I almost forgot about the experiment altogether until weird things started happening. It began with little stuff that was easy to dismiss. I'd hear noises outside my apartment at odd hours, footsteps, the creak of a gate, the soft hum of a car engine that would rev up and then die down. I live in a fairly busy area of LA, so it didn't strike me as anything out of the ordinary. But then, it got weirder. One day, as I was walking back from class, I noticed a car trailing behind me. It was subtle at first, just a glance in the rearview mirror, but as I continued walking, the car kept pace with me. It wasn't speeding up to pass me or slowing down to park. It just kept crawling along beside me. I quickened my pace, turning down a side street, hoping to lose it. When I turned to look, the car had sped off. I didn't think too much about it. I figured it was probably just some lost driver or someone messing with me. But then the calls started. At first, they were blocked numbers, and I didn't bother answering them. After a few days, I began receiving text messages from unknown numbers. They were vague at first, random messages like "nice day today" or "how's school going?" Nothing too alarming, but it caught my attention. It wasn't until one night, while working late at a cafe near campus, that things took a serious turn. I received a text that read, "Nice red shirt." That's when my stomach dropped. I was wearing a red shirt that night. Whoever was texting me wasn't just some random spammer, they could see me. I looked around the cafe trying to spot someone suspicious, but everyone seemed engrossed in their laptops or phones minding their own business. I was spooked, but not entirely freaked out. I figured it was some sort of prank. Maybe a friend had found out about the experiment and was messing with me. I decided to head home early that night. On the way back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling jumpy but trying to play it cool. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The streets were quiet, the usual late-night sounds of the city surrounding me. But just as I reached my building, I saw someone standing at the corner of the block, partially hidden in the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing there, almost like they were waiting for me. I hesitated at the door for a second before rushing inside. I didn't even turn around to see if the figure was still there. When I got to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and immediately went to the window. The street below was empty. The figure, whoever they were, had disappeared. I didn't sleep much that night, but I convinced myself that it was all just paranoia. Maybe this was part of the experiment, I reasoned. Maybe they were testing how I would react to fear. I tried to calm down, but my nerves were shot. The next day, things seemed normal again. I went to class, grabbed lunch with a friend, and tried to get on with life. But when I got back home that evening, I found a letter waiting for me on my doorstep. It wasn't mailed. It had been hand-delivered. There was no return address, just my name on the envelope. I opened it carefully, and inside was a single piece of paper with one line written on it. "We're watching." That's when I really started to freak out. I went online to try and find the forum I had signed up for, but the site had disappeared. No trace of it remained. I even tried searching the dark web for similar forums, but nothing came up. I didn't know who to contact or what to do. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I started getting more letters, always hand-delivered and left at my door when I wasn't home. The messages became more personal. Details about my life, my routine, my friends. They even mentioned specific conversations I had with people. Conversations that had taken place in private. I knew then that they were listening to me somehow, tracking me, following me wherever I went. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Someone was actively stalking me. I started staying home as much as possible, trying to avoid going out unless absolutely necessary. But even that didn't help. One night, as I was sitting in my apartment, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. They were slow and deliberate, stopping right outside my door. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps stayed there for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, they retreated. I ran to the door and peered through the peephole, but no one was there. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving LA, going back to my parents' place in Northern California. But I was too scared to tell them what was going on. I didn't want to drag them into this nightmare. Besides, I didn't know if running away would even help. Whoever was behind this seemed to know everything about me. If I left, they could probably find me wherever I went. One day, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My stomach sank as I pushed it open, half expecting to find someone inside. But the place was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing, a single rose on my kitchen table. It hadn't been there when I left that morning. Someone had been inside my apartment. I checked all the locks and windows, but everything was secure. I had no idea how they had gotten in. After that, I stopped feeling safe in my own home. I started sleeping with the lights on, a knife under my pillow, but it didn't make much difference. The fear was constant, gnawing at me every second of every day. I tried reaching out to friends for help, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the full story. I didn't want to sound crazy or have them think I was losing my mind. One afternoon, I decided to confront whoever was behind this. I sent an email to the address I had used to sign up for the experiment, demanding that they stop harassing me. I threatened to go to the police to expose them. I was angry and desperate, willing to try anything to make this nightmare end. A few days later, I received a response. It was short and to the point. The experiment is over, but we'll always be watching. After that, things seemed to quiet down. The texts and letters stopped and no one followed me anymore. I tried to move on with my life, but the damage was already done. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if they were still out there, watching me. Every time I heard a noise outside my door, I would freeze, waiting for something terrible to happen. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling of unease. I've changed my phone number, moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city, but it doesn't help. The fear is always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. About 3 years ago, when I was a senior at the University of Washington in Seattle, back then I was really into tech and online privacy, probably a little too into it, to be honest. I was a computer science major, and a lot of my classmates were obsessed with things like encryption, secure networks, and keeping their online presence locked down. It was kind of the culture among us. We were all pretty paranoid about our data getting out there. I wasn't exactly paranoid, but I was definitely fascinated by the idea of anonymity, especially in a world where everything seemed so connected. I'd read stories about people who managed to erase themselves from the grid, people who started fresh with new names, new lives, and no trace of their old selves. It sounded exciting, like a modern-day escape. One night, while I was digging around on some forums, not your usual places, but the kind of deep web stuff most people try to avoid, I stumbled across a site that promised exactly what I'd been reading about. They claimed to offer a service that could create new identities, completely untraceable with everything you'd need: documents, online profiles, bank accounts, you name it. The idea wasn't entirely new to me. I'd read about services like this before, but they usually catered to criminals or people trying to disappear for darker reasons. Still, I was curious. I wasn't planning to run away or anything. I just wanted to see if it could really be done. If you could actually create a new version of yourself online that no one could trace back to you. I told myself it was for research. Maybe it was, at first, but the deeper I got into it, the more it felt like a challenge. I wanted to see how far I could go. The site wasn't easy to navigate, but after a lot of digging, I found the section that offered identity creation. The first thing they asked for was some basic personal info. Nothing too invasive, just stuff like my name, address, and date of birth. I hesitated at first, but I figured it couldn't hurt. I gave them the info, and after that, things started moving fast. They asked for more details, things like my social security number and bank information. That's when I should have stopped. Any rational person would have realized that this was a huge red flag. But I was cocky. I thought I knew what I was doing, that I could control the situation. So I gave them what they wanted. For a few days, nothing happened. I figured the whole thing had been a waste of time, some kind of scam, and I'd just have to cancel my bank account and get a new one to be safe. But then things started getting weird. I first noticed it when I tried to log into my bank account one afternoon. I'd just finished class and was checking to see if my paycheck had cleared from my part-time job at a local tech repair shop. But when I tried to log in, the system kept rejecting my password. I thought maybe I'd forgotten it or typed it in wrong, so I went through the whole process of resetting it. When I finally got back in, I saw several transactions that I didn't recognize, large sums of money being moved in and out of my account. It didn't make any sense. The transactions were happening at times when I hadn't even been near my computer. I immediately called my bank to report it. But while I was on the phone with them, the agent told me that my account had been flagged for suspicious activity and had already been temporarily frozen. The strange part was that the freeze had happened just minutes before I called, almost like someone knew I was about to check. I was freaked out, but I figured it was just some hacker who had gotten my info. I thought I'd be able to sort it out with the bank and move on. I spent hours on the phone with them, going through all the transactions and securing the account. They assured me that they'd block any further activity and that I'd be reimbursed for the money that had been stolen. I believed them. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of notifications from my social media accounts. I'd been locked out of every single one of them: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even my email. Every account had been accessed from unfamiliar locations and had been used to post strange, cryptic messages. Some of the posts were harmless, but others were disturbing. On my Facebook, there were posts talking about things I'd never say, mentioning places I'd never been, and sharing photos that weren't mine. On Instagram, someone had uploaded pictures of places I'd never visited, but they looked real, like I had actually been there. The photos were of me, or at least someone who looked like me, in places like Portland, Vancouver, and even further away, like New York City. But I hadn't left Seattle in months. I tried to recover my accounts, but every time I got close, I was locked out again. It was like someone was one step ahead of me, waiting for me to try to fix things so they could screw them up again. It felt like I was fighting a ghost, someone who knew everything about me, but who I couldn't see or touch. I ended up spending hours on the phone with tech support for each platform, trying to regain control. It was exhausting, but eventually I managed to lock down most of my accounts. I thought I was making progress, but the damage had already been done. My friends were messaging me, confused and concerned about the things I'd supposedly posted. Some of them thought I'd been hacked, but others weren't so sure. The posts seemed too personal, too specific to be random. A few people even asked me if I was in some kind of trouble, if I needed help. I didn't know what to tell them because I didn't understand what was happening myself. As the days went on, things got worse. I started getting phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and when I answered, no one was there. Sometimes it was just silence on the other end. Other times I could hear faint breathing, like someone was listening but didn't want to speak. I blocked the numbers, but new ones kept coming. Then people started reaching out to me directly, people I didn't know, asking me about things I had no memory of. Some claimed we'd met in person at events or parties in cities I'd never been to. Others said they'd worked with me on projects that didn't exist. They had details, specific things about me that only someone who knew me could possibly know. But I had no idea who they were. I began to realize that whoever had stolen my identity wasn't just hacking into my accounts. They were living as me. They were creating a version of me that I had no control over. And the scariest part was that they were doing a damn good job of it. One day, I got a call from a number that looked familiar. It was my parents' home phone in California. I answered, expecting to hear my mom's voice on the other end. Instead, it was some guy I didn't recognize. He started talking to me like we were old friends, asking me how my trip to Los Angeles had been. I hadn't been to LA in over a year, but this guy seemed to think we'd spent time together there recently. I asked him who he was, and he laughed like I was joking. He said he'd met me at a conference and that we'd exchanged numbers. When I insisted that he must have the wrong person, he got quiet. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Come on, Max, don't mess with me. We just talked about this last week." I hung up and immediately called my parents. They had no idea what I was talking about. They hadn't been home when the call came through, and they definitely hadn't given my number to anyone. After that, I started to unravel. I couldn't trust anything anymore. Every day brought new nightmares. I'd get texts from people I'd never met, emails from companies thanking me for purchases I hadn't made, even letters in the mail addressed to me, but sent from places I'd never been. My bank account, which I thought I'd secured, was hit again with more fraudulent transactions, this time from international locations. I ended up having to close it entirely and open a new one. But even that didn't help. Whoever was behind this seemed to have access to everything. It was like they knew every move I made before I even made it. They were inside my life, controlling it from the shadows, and I had no way of stopping them. I went to the police, but they weren't much help. They took down my information and said they'd investigate, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. To them, it probably just seemed like another case of identity theft. Annoying, but not life-ruining. I tried to explain that this was different, that it wasn't just about money or accounts being hacked, but they didn't understand. How could they? Even I didn't fully understand what was happening. I ended up reaching out to some cybersecurity experts, hoping they could help me track down whoever was doing this. But every lead they followed turned up nothing. The person, or people, behind this were smart. They knew how to cover their tracks, how to make it look like I was the one doing everything. Not them. It was like they'd erased the real me and replaced me with this twisted version of myself. At some point, I had to accept that there was no going back to normal. My life had been hijacked, and no matter how hard I tried to fix it, I was always one step behind. The person who had stolen my identity had become me, in a way that I couldn't undo. They were out there, living a life that wasn't theirs to live, and I was left picking up the pieces of the one they'd destroyed. I'm a freelance writer based in Portland, Oregon. It was around 4 years ago that things started to go off the rails for me. At the time, I was taking on a bunch of random gigs, scraping by with low-paying articles, content creation for small companies, and the occasional copywriting job. Money was tight, and I was getting desperate for something more steady. Freelance life can be brutal, especially when you're not landing the big projects. One night, during a stretch of particularly lean months, I was browsing the web looking for some new leads. I stumbled across a forum that was buried pretty deep, one of those dark web places where anonymity is key, and people share information that you definitely wouldn't find on regular sites. I knew better than to mess around with the dark web, but curiosity got the better of me. I told myself it was just out of interest, just to see what kinds of things people were talking about on there. It felt like a glimpse into a world that most people would never see. The forum was called something vague, like Influence Exchange or something along those lines. The whole point of it was to gather and sell information about public figures, celebrities, politicians, anyone with a certain level of influence. The idea was that users would share tips, dirt, rumors, whatever they could get their hands on, and the site would pay out for anything valuable enough to use as leverage. It was all about blackmail, though the word itself was never explicitly used. Instead, they referred to it as leveraging influence, which made it sound less sinister than it really was. At first, I was just lurking, reading through the posts. Most of them were from people claiming to have insider knowledge about various famous figures, illicit affairs, drug habits, financial scandals, that sort of thing. Some of the posts seemed legit. Others were clearly made-up nonsense. But what got my attention was that some of the people on the forum were making serious money from these tips. The payouts they were bragging about were huge, like tens of thousands of dollars for the right piece of information. I should have closed my browser right then and there, but I didn't. I convinced myself it wasn't such a big deal. I figured I could share something harmless. Just a small tidbit that wouldn't really hurt anyone, and maybe I'd make a little cash to get me through the dry spell. I wasn't thinking straight, I guess. I just saw an opportunity and grabbed it without really considering the consequences. I started small. The first thing I posted was some gossip I'd heard about a local politician at a party a few years earlier. It wasn't anything that would destroy their career, just some embarrassing details about a fight they'd had with a partner in public. I didn't think much of it. Honestly, it seemed like nothing compared to the kinds of things other people were posting. A day later, I got a message from the forum's moderators. They'd reviewed my post, confirmed its validity somehow, and deposited a few $100 into an anonymous wallet they'd set up for me. It was easy. Too easy. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back. I'd browse the forum, looking for posts about people I knew, and then I'd add little details or expand on the rumors if I could. Sometimes I'd dig up stuff from my old interviews or interactions with people in the industry. I was careful not to get too personal, nothing that would ruin anyone's life, at least not at first. It became a game, almost like a puzzle, figuring out what information was worth money and what wasn't. But the thing with these kinds of games is that they escalate quickly. After a while, I started getting messages from other users asking if I had anything more valuable, real dirt, stuff that could be used to exert serious pressure on someone. The moderators also started pushing me to provide juicier information. They offered bigger payouts, promising that the more serious the leverage, the more I'd get in return. I should have bailed right there, but I didn't. The money was coming in steadily by that point, and I felt like I was in control. I thought I could play the game without getting too deep. Then one day, I got a message from someone on the forum who claimed to have hacked into my phone. At first, I thought it was just a scare tactic, some idiot trying to intimidate me. But then they sent me a screenshot of my own text messages, private conversations I'd had with friends and family. My heart sank. They had access to everything. It wasn't just my messages either. They'd gotten into my photos, my email, my bank accounts, everything. I immediately went into damage control mode. I tried to wipe my phone, change my passwords, lock down my accounts, but it didn't matter. They were already inside, and there was no way to get them out. A few days later, I got another message. This time they attached a bunch of personal photos, intimate photos that I never intended anyone else to see. They threatened to release them if I didn't keep providing information. That's when it hit me. I was trapped. I tried to explain to them that I didn't have anything more to give, but they didn't care. They demanded more, and when I hesitated, they sent another threat. This time it was a copy of my bank records, showing that they'd drained several $1,000s from my account. I was completely at their mercy. I couldn't go to the police, not without admitting that I'd been involved in blackmailing people online. I couldn't reach out to my friends or family either. What was I supposed to tell them? That I'd gotten involved in something illegal, and now I was being blackmailed myself? I felt ashamed, embarrassed, and completely powerless. For a while, I tried to continue living my life as normally as possible. I kept taking on writing gigs, paying my bills, and pretending like nothing was wrong. But in the background, the demands kept coming. Every few weeks, I'd get another message from the forum moderators or one of their associates, asking for more information. They didn't even care if it was relevant anymore. They just wanted to keep me on the hook. And every time I hesitated, they'd send me a reminder of what they had. My photos, my messages, my financial records. They had complete control over me, and there was nothing I could do about it. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. I couldn't keep up with their demands, and I started to fall behind on my other work. My clients noticed that something was off, and I lost a few contracts because I couldn't focus. I was constantly anxious, checking my phone every few minutes, terrified of what might come next. The stress was unbearable. I barely slept, and when I did, I had nightmares about my life falling apart, about everything being exposed. I knew I had to get out, but I didn't know how. I couldn't just disappear. Not without abandoning everything and everyone I cared about, so I did the only thing I could think of. I started feeding them false information. I made up stories, created fake scandals, fabricated details about people who didn't exist. I figured if I could keep them busy with bullshit, maybe they'd back off for a while and I could figure out a way to fix this mess. For a while, it seemed to work. The messages slowed down and the demands became less frequent. I started to think that maybe I'd found a way out, that I could bullshit my way through this until they lost interest. But that hope was short-lived. One day I got a package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the front in thick black marker. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message typed out in bold letters. "We know you're lying." My stomach dropped. I don't know how they figured it out, but they knew. They knew I'd been feeding them fake information, and now they were angry. The next few days were a blur of panic and fear. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for my photos to start circulating online, for my bank account to be emptied again. But nothing happened. The silence was almost worse than the threats. It was like they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That was a few months ago. Since then, things have been quiet. Too quiet. I haven't heard from the forum or its moderators, but I know they're still out there. I don't know why they've gone silent. Maybe they've moved on to another victim, or maybe they're just biding their time, waiting for the right moment to destroy me. Every day, I wake up expecting to see my private life plastered all over the internet. But so far, nothing has happened. I used to live a pretty normal life. I'm a lawyer in my early 30s, living in Chicago. Back then, I had a decent career, good friends, and a pretty solid social life. Nothing extraordinary, just normal. I worked hard, hung out with my friends on the weekends, and occasionally posted on social media like everyone else. I wasn't obsessed with it or anything, but I had the usual accounts: Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. It was just part of staying connected in today's world. One night while I was unwinding after a long day at work, I got a text from a close friend. She sent me a link to a video, and I could tell from the way she phrased it that she was serious and concerned. She told me to watch it immediately and to call her as soon as I did. I clicked on the link without thinking too much about it. Probably just some news article or something funny she found online. It wasn't anything like that. The link took me to an adult content site. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe she'd sent me the wrong link. But when I hit play, my heart dropped. The video was of me, or at least it looked like me, in a very graphic situation that I had never been in. The woman in the video was doing things I'd never done, in places I'd never been, with people I'd never seen before. But it was my face, my exact face, down to every little detail. The expression, the way the hair fell, even the slight scar on my forehead, it was all there staring back at me. I immediately called my friend, my voice shaking, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. She told me she hadn't believed it was really me, but the resemblance was uncanny. She'd been sent the video by someone she didn't know, and the message that came with it was vague but creepy. It was something like, "Thought you should see what your friend is up to." She hadn't responded, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. And after a couple of days, she worked up the courage to send it to me. I was in shock. I couldn't wrap my head around it at first. How could this even be possible? I had never done anything like what was in the video. I barely dated, let alone filmed myself in these kinds of situations. But the more I watched, the more I started to question myself, not because I thought I'd been secretly filmed, but because it was so realistic that it made me feel sick. It was as if someone had found a way to crawl into my skin, wear my face, and act out these scenes as me. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about it. I blocked the site, blocked the person who had sent the video to my friend, and reassured myself that this had to be some kind of one-off mistake, something I wouldn't have to deal with again. I thought I could move past it if I just ignored it. But that's not how things work on the internet. Once something is out there, it's out there for good. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just one video. There were dozens of them. Different scenarios, different men, different locations. Each one featured my face, my likeness, and it was always something graphic, humiliating, and disturbing. It wasn't just my face pasted onto another body. It was seamless. Whoever had made these videos knew what they were doing, and they were doing it with terrifying precision. The worst part was how the videos spread. They were being shared on social media, sent around in group chats, and linked to on forums. I started getting messages from people I hadn't talked to in years. Old friends, acquaintances, even some colleagues from work. Some of them asked me directly if the videos were real, while others just stopped talking to me altogether. I could see their judgment in the way they looked at me. Even when they didn't say it, I knew they believed the videos were real. It wasn't long before the videos found their way to my professional life. Someone sent a link to one of my coworkers, and it spread like wildfire around the office. People started whispering behind my back, and I could feel the shift in the way my bosses treated me. They never said anything outright, but I could tell they didn't know what to make of it. I was a lawyer, for God's sake. How could this be happening to me? I tried to get the videos taken down. I contacted the websites, filed reports, sent emails, everything I could think of. But for every video that got removed, 2 more would pop up. It was like playing whack-a-mole. And the people who were sharing them were relentless. They kept spreading them to new platforms, new sites, places I didn't even know existed. Some of the videos even made their way to more mainstream sites that I used to trust. I went to the police thinking they could help me. They took my statement and looked at the evidence, but they didn't seem to understand what was really happening. They treated it like some kind of identity theft, something they could handle with a few reports and a couple of phone calls. They told me to change my passwords and lock down my social media, as if that would somehow fix the problem. But the videos weren't coming from my accounts. They were being created by someone else, and no amount of password changes would stop them. I even hired a private investigator, hoping they could track down the person responsible. But after weeks of searching, they came up with nothing. Whoever was behind this was smart, careful. They knew how to cover their tracks, how to hide behind layers of anonymity. It was like they were a ghost, always one step ahead, always out of reach. At some point, I had to accept that there was no way to stop it. The videos kept coming, and there was nothing I could do to stop their spread. I tried to keep working to keep my life together, but everything was falling apart. My friends started distancing themselves from me, and I couldn't blame them. The videos were so convincing that even I started to question what was real and what wasn't. It was hard to remember who I was when the entire internet seemed convinced I was someone else. Eventually, my work found an excuse to let me go. They didn't fire me outright, but they started cutting my hours, reassigning my cases, until there was nothing left for me to do. I tried looking for other jobs, but the videos had followed me everywhere. Every potential employer would Google my name and find those videos. It didn't matter that they weren't real. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had that kind of content circulating online. My reputation was ruined, and there was no coming back from it. I stopped leaving the house. It felt like everyone who saw me had already seen the videos, like they were judging me, laughing at me behind my back. Even when I went to the grocery store or walked through my neighborhood, I felt the weight of their stares. I knew it was probably just in my head, but that didn't make it any easier. I couldn't escape it. The videos had become a part of me even though I'd never been in them, never done the things they showed. I tried deleting my social media accounts, going offline completely, but it didn't matter. The videos were still out there, still circulating, still spreading. I was trapped in this nightmare version of myself, and there was no way to escape it. No matter what I did, the internet had already made up its mind about who I was. The worst part is, I don't know who did this to me or why. I've thought about it endlessly, trying to figure out who would hate me enough to ruin my life like this, but I've never come up with an answer. It could be someone I know, someone who holds a grudge against me for something I don't even remember. Or it could be a complete stranger, someone who found my face online and decided to use it for their own sick purposes. I'll probably never know. I've spent so much time thinking about how this all happened, how someone could have used my face so perfectly. It wasn't just the face-swapping technology you see in those meme videos. This was something far more advanced. Whoever did this had access to hours of footage of me, videos, photos, everything. They must have pulled it all from my social media, from every little post, every tagged photo, every video I'd ever been in. And then they pieced it all together, creating a version of me that never existed, but one that looked so real it was impossible to deny. I've tried reaching out to some tech experts, hoping they could help me understand how it was done, maybe even reverse it. But they all said the same thing: once it's out there, there's no way to undo it. The internet doesn't forget. Even if I managed to get every single video taken down, someone somewhere would have already saved it, and it would just start spreading all over again. So now, here I am. I'm still living in Chicago, but my life is a shadow of what it once was. I barely leave my apartment, and when I do, I keep my head down, hoping no one recognizes me. I've cut ties with most of my old friends, not because I don't miss them, but because I don't want to drag them into this mess. My family knows what happened, but they don't really understand. They try to be supportive, but there's only so much they can do. They don't get how deep this goes, how completely it's taken over my life. I've always been into hiking. It's my way of escaping the daily grind. Living in Denver, Colorado, I'm lucky to have access to some of the most beautiful trails in the country, from the Rocky Mountains to lesser-known paths just outside the city. It's something I've been doing for years, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, but always with the same sense of freedom and peace. That is, until all of this started. I'd heard about this hiking app on a forum, something not too mainstream, but supposedly with great offline maps and some cool features for more adventurous trails. It wasn't on the regular app stores, which should have been my first red flag, but I was always looking for new spots to explore, so I downloaded it directly from the site. It seemed legit enough. Reviews from other hikers, a nice interface, GPS tracking that could be used even when you were off-grid. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. I was just eager to try it out. The first few hikes I used the app on were pretty normal. It tracked my route, mapped out nearby trails, and even highlighted some off-the-beaten-path spots that weren't on other apps. It seemed like a win. But then things started getting weird. It was subtle at first, almost too subtle to notice. I'd be out on a trail, enjoying the peace and quiet, when I'd notice people in the distance who didn't quite fit. These weren't your average hikers. They weren't wearing hiking boots or carrying any gear, and they'd be just a little too close to me, even in spots that were usually deserted. At first, I just chalked it up to coincidence. After all, I wasn't the only one who liked to get away from the popular trails. Maybe these people had just found the same hidden gems that I had. But then it kept happening. No matter where I went, I'd find the same type of people, always just out of sight, but close enough that I'd notice them. And it wasn't just once or twice. It was every hike. Even in the most remote areas, I'd see someone lurking at a distance, hanging back as if they were trying not to be seen, but making themselves known just enough to make me uneasy. One time, I was hiking a relatively difficult trail near Mount Evans. I had planned it as an all-day trip and started early to avoid the midday heat. The trail was pretty rugged, and I didn't expect to see anyone else for most of the hike. But about halfway through, I noticed someone behind me. I only caught a glimpse of them at first, just a flash of movement through the trees. When I stopped to look, they disappeared, so I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I kept going, I noticed them again. They weren't close enough for me to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person, always staying just out of reach. No matter how fast or slow I went, they kept the same distance. It was like they were matching my pace, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. I decided to take a break at a small clearing near a stream. I sat down to eat something and catch my breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. After a few minutes, I glanced back at the trail and saw them again. This time, they were standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind some trees. I could see them more clearly now. An older man, probably in his 50s with no hiking gear, just jeans and a jacket that seemed way too warm for the weather. He was just standing there, watching me. I pretended not to notice him and packed up my things, deciding to continue on the trail. As I moved, I kept glancing over my shoulder, but he didn't follow. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was there for a reason. Maybe it was paranoia, but something about the whole situation felt off. It wasn't normal for someone to be that deep into a trail without any gear or supplies, especially not dressed like that. I finished the hike as quickly as I could and made my way back to the trailhead. By the time I got there, the man was gone, and I convinced myself that I was just overreacting. Maybe he'd been lost or just out for a walk, but the whole experience left me rattled. A few days later, I went on another hike, this time at a different spot closer to Boulder. It was a trail I'd done plenty of times before, so I wasn't expecting any surprises. But once again, I noticed someone following me. This time, it was a woman, probably in her 30s, wearing a long coat that seemed totally impractical for hiking. She wasn't too close, but I could see her from time to time through the trees. She never made any attempt to catch up, but she was always there, just far enough away to make it seem like she could have been coincidentally on the same trail. I started to get paranoid. I'd look for her at every turn, and even when I couldn't see her, I felt like she was still there, keeping her distance but always watching. I ended up cutting the hike short and heading back to my car. As I was packing up my gear, I noticed her standing at the edge of the parking lot, just staring at me. I drove off as quickly as I could, not even bothering to change out of my boots until I got home. After that, I stopped using the app for a while. I figured maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe the app had been tracking my location and sending it to other users without my knowledge. I deleted it from my phone, reset all my privacy settings, and tried to forget about it. But the damage had already been done. Even without the app, the strange encounters continued. I'd go on hikes with different groups of friends, thinking that being with others would keep me safe. But we'd still see people lurking in the distance, always watching but never approaching. It was like they knew where I was going to be, no matter how spontaneous the hike was or how far I traveled from my usual spots. One time, a friend and I drove out to a trailhead about 2 hours south of Denver, way off the beaten path. It was a last-minute decision, and we didn't tell anyone where we were going. But even there, in the middle of nowhere, we ran into the same unsettling situation. We were about halfway through the hike when we spotted a man standing on the trail ahead of us, looking down at his phone. As we got closer, he didn't move or acknowledge us, just stood there staring at the screen. When we passed him, I glanced at his phone, and I swear I saw the same app I'd been using. It had the same layout, the same icons, everything. I tried not to panic and kept walking, but the moment we were out of earshot, I told my friend everything that had been happening. She looked at me like I was crazy, but when I showed her the app's website later, she admitted it looked familiar. That was the last time I hiked for a long while. I couldn't enjoy it anymore. Every time I went out, I felt like I was being followed, like someone was always one step behind me, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And the scariest part was, I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. It wasn't like they ever did anything overtly threatening. They never approached me, never said anything. But the way they watched, the way they seemed to know exactly where I'd be, was enough to keep me on edge. I tried talking to a few people about it, friends, family, even a co-worker or two, but no one seemed to understand. They all thought it was just paranoia, maybe a side effect of spending too much time alone in the wilderness. I started to doubt myself too, wondering if maybe I was just overreacting, if it was all in my head. But the encounters were too real, too consistent to ignore. Eventually, I decided to go back to the app's website, hoping to find some kind of explanation, maybe a clue as to what was happening. But the site was gone, completely wiped from the internet. There were no mentions of it anywhere, no reviews, no forum posts. It was like it had never existed in the first place. I even tried searching through some of the darker corners of the web, but all I found were dead ends. After that, I gave up hiking for a while. It just wasn't worth the stress anymore. Every time I thought about going out on a trail, I'd remember those people. The way they followed me, the way they watched, and I'd lose all motivation. It wasn't until months later that I started to feel like I could go back out there, and even then, I only went with a large group of friends. I haven't hiked alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. It all started when I was bored and browsing some dark web forums. I know, stupid move. I'd read enough online to know better, but I've always had this morbid curiosity about that side of the internet. It's easy to think it's just a bunch of myths or exaggerated stories. But there are dark corners of the web where really sick stuff happens. I was just too naive to believe I'd stumble across anything real. I'd convinced myself that it was just another playground for conspiracy theorists and edgy teens trying to freak each other out. I wasn't looking for anything specific when I found it, a site offering huge payouts for what they called disruptive acts. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke or a poorly designed role-playing game. The whole setup seemed a little too over the top, like something out of a bad thriller. They claimed to pay for sabotaging public infrastructure, messing with transportation systems, or even screwing with utilities. It was all framed in this weird, almost academic tone, like they were conducting some kind of social experiment on a grand scale. They didn't outright call it terrorism, but that's basically what it was. The site was slick, minimalist, professional, nothing like the sketchy forums I'd seen before. The language they used was clinical, like they were just another company hiring freelancers. They didn't refer to violence directly. Instead, they talked about creating instability and shifting the balance of power. And the money they were offering was insane. Way more than I'd ever seen in my life. Thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars for jobs that seemed like pranks at first glance. I should have walked away right then. But something about the site drew me in. I'd been unemployed for months, barely scraping by on odd jobs and side gigs. and the idea of making that kind of money for what seemed like simple tasks was too tempting. The first job they posted was a small one, messing with traffic lights in a part of the city I barely ever visited. They didn't ask for much detail either, just the willingness to follow through. I figured it wasn't a big deal. Traffic lights go down all the time, right? So I signed up. It wasn't until after I completed the job that I realized how serious things were. I followed their instructions to the letter, flipping a couple of switches in a control box they'd somehow pinpointed. The lights went out for a few hours in a small part of Denver, and traffic was a mess for the rest of the day. Nothing major happened, and I thought that was it. But the payment came through within hours, $5,000 in Bitcoin. It felt surreal. I had this sinking feeling that I'd crossed a line, but the money was in my account, and I convinced myself it was harmless. Just a quick job. No one got hurt. The next job they posted was more complicated, shutting down power to a neighborhood for a few hours. They sent detailed instructions on how to access a substation, what equipment to disable, and even the timing to make sure it didn't cause any long-term damage. I was nervous, but the payment they were offering was even bigger, $15,000. It was enough to cover my rent for months, so I pushed down my anxiety and went through with it. This time, it was different. When I cut the power, I could hear the distant sounds of car alarms going off, and later I found out that the blackout had caused all sorts of chaos in the area. People were stuck in elevators, businesses lost money, and one guy even got into a pretty bad car accident at an intersection with no working traffic signals. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't a game or a prank. These people were serious. They were coordinating large-scale disruptions, and I was helping them do it. I tried to rationalize it at first, telling myself it was just a coincidence that the guy in the car accident would have crashed anyway. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I was responsible, even if indirectly, for what was happening, and now I was in too deep. I tried to back out after that. I told them I wasn't interested in doing any more jobs, that I'd made enough money and was done. But that's not how it works with these kinds of people. The messages I started getting from the site were polite at first, almost friendly, but they made it clear that I wasn't free to just walk away. They had information on me, my name, my address, and enough personal details to make it clear that they could reach me anytime they wanted. The next job they posted was bigger, and this time they made it clear that there would be consequences if I didn't follow through. It wasn't just some small neighborhood blackout. They wanted me to sabotage a section of the city's water supply. Not poison it or anything, just disrupt it enough to cause panic. I felt sick reading the instructions, knowing what it could do to people. This wasn't just about causing inconvenience. This was about messing with people's lives in a real, tangible way. And now, I didn't have a choice. I remember sitting at my desk for hours that night, staring at the message and trying to figure out a way out of it. But the longer I waited, the more pressure they applied. They sent me reminders, subtle threats, always phrased like business correspondence, but laced with something darker underneath. I didn't know who was behind the site, and they made it clear that I never would. They didn't need to know me personally to make my life hell. They had all the information they needed. When I finally completed the job, it felt like the final nail in the coffin. I spent hours at the site, disabling a valve that controlled water flow to part of the city. It was nerve-wracking, not just because I knew what I was doing was wrong, but because I was terrified of getting caught. I was careful, though. They'd given me specific instructions to avoid leaving behind any obvious signs, and I followed them meticulously. By the time I was done, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely drive home. The fallout from that job was much bigger than anything I'd expected. The water disruption lasted for days and people were panicking. Local news stations covered it nonstop, and I even saw a few interviews with residents who were losing their minds over the lack of water. I was horrified. But what scared me the most was how quickly it became clear that no one had any idea what had really caused the disruption. The city blamed it on a technical malfunction, and that was the end of it. The group I was working for had orchestrated the perfect crime, massive chaos with no trace of the people behind it. I thought that would be the end of it, that after I did the job they'd let me go. But I was wrong. The next message I got from them wasn't a request for another job. It was a warning. They told me I was now invested in their work, and that if I ever thought about going to the police or trying to stop them, they'd make sure everything I'd done came back to haunt me. They even included some photos, pictures of me at the sites where I'd done the jobs, looking over my shoulder, completely unaware I was being watched. They had me cornered, and there was nothing I could do about it. I stopped responding to their messages after that. I shut down the email account they'd been contacting me on, deleted every trace of my involvement that I could find, and went completely off the grid for a while. I even moved to a new apartment, hoping that maybe they'd lose track of me if I laid low. But they didn't. Every few months, I'd get another message from them. Sometimes just a reminder that they were still watching, other times asking me to check in, as if I was still part of their little operation. They didn't ask me to do any more jobs, but they didn't have to. They'd already gotten what they needed out of me, and now they were just keeping me in line, making sure I didn't get any ideas about exposing them. It's been over 2 years now, and I haven't heard from them in a while. A few years ago, I was working as a private investigator in Los Angeles, mostly taking on low-level cases like cheating spouses and insurance fraud. The work was pretty mundane, long hours of following people around, sifting through piles of digital evidence, and dealing with clients who were either heartbroken or pissed off. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I had a knack for it. I never expected to get involved in anything dangerous or sinister, but then I took on a case that changed everything for me. It started with a missing person report. A woman named Lauren had disappeared from her apartment in Silver Lake. Her parents were desperate, and after the police hit a dead end, they turned to me. She was in her mid-20s, worked in tech, and had no history of disappearing before. She'd been living a pretty normal life as far as I could tell, and there were no obvious red flags. No abusive ex-boyfriends, no drug problems, nothing to suggest she'd run off or fallen into trouble. She had simply vanished. I started with the usual, interviewing her friends, co-workers, and neighbors, checking phone records, credit card transactions, social media activity. But there wasn't much to go on. Her last known whereabouts were at her apartment, where she'd been seen on her building's security cameras entering around 7 p.m. on a Friday night. After that, nothing. Her phone had gone dead, and there were no signs of a struggle in her apartment. It was like she had just walked out and never came back. I spent weeks chasing leads, but every trail went cold. Her friends were at a loss, her coworkers didn't have anything useful to offer, and her family was growing increasingly desperate. At one point, I started to think this was going to be one of those cases that never gets solved. I hate admitting defeat, but it happens in this line of work more often than you'd think. Then, out of the blue, I got an email. It was anonymous, sent from a random encrypted service. The message was short and cryptic, just a link to a dark web forum and the words, "This is what you're looking for." Normally, I'd have deleted something like that right away. There are plenty of people who enjoy messing with investigators, throwing us off the trail with nonsense leads. But something about this felt different. I followed the link. The forum was unlike anything I'd seen before. It wasn't your typical dark web marketplace for drugs, stolen credit cards, or illegal services. This place was specific, focused on what they called custom kidnappings. People would post requests for abductions, detailing who they wanted taken, when, and how. The level of detail in some of the posts was terrifying. There were specific instructions about how to lure the targets, what to say, what kind of vehicles to use. In some cases, they even specified what should be done to the person after they were taken. I felt sick reading through it. The people posting these requests weren't after ransom money or leverage. A lot of them just wanted to exert control over someone's life, to know that they had the power to make someone disappear. In some of the posts, they didn't even want anything in return. It was enough for them to just see it happen. I spent hours going through the posts, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were hundreds of requests, some of them years old, others more recent. And then I saw one that made my heart drop. It was a post from about 6 months earlier, requesting the abduction of a young woman from Los Angeles. The description fit Lauren perfectly. Her age, her appearance, her job. There were even details about her routine, like what time she usually left work and what nights she tended to stay late at the office. The post had been marked as completed a week after it was made. That was when I realized that this wasn't just a forum for fantasists or people with sick fetishes. This was real. Someone had used this site to have Lauren kidnapped, and they'd succeeded. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The whole case had been turned on its head. I wasn't dealing with a simple missing person anymore. This was something far more organized and terrifying than anything I'd ever encountered before. I went back to the email that had sent me the link. Whoever had sent it clearly knew something, but I had no way of contacting them. It was a one-way communication. I felt completely out of my depth, like I was in way over my head, but I couldn't just walk away from it now. I had to figure out what had happened to Lauren. I kept digging through the forum, trying to piece together how this operation worked. The people behind it were smart. They used layers of encryption, fake accounts, and proxies to hide their identities. They had a system in place to make sure nothing could be traced back to them. And they were careful about who they worked with. Most of the posts were anonymous, and the jobs were assigned to people who seemed to specialize in this kind of work. It wasn't just random people signing up for gigs, it was professionals. After a while, I found another post that chilled me to the bone. It was from someone offering to kidnap people for free. They didn't want payment or compensation. They said they got off on the power trip of making people disappear, of knowing they had the ability to alter someone's life forever without leaving a trace. It was clear that this person had done it before and would do it again. I realized then that this wasn't just about Lauren. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of people out there who had been taken by this group. Some of them might still be alive, held somewhere against their will, while others... I didn't want to think about what might have happened to them. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't exactly go to the police with what I'd found. They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, I had no hard evidence to back up my claims. Everything I'd found was buried in the dark web, and there was no clear trail to follow. I was dealing with people who were professionals at covering their tracks, people who knew how to operate in the shadows. But I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't stop thinking about Lauren, about what she must have gone through. The thought of her being taken by these people, of being held captive somewhere, was unbearable. I felt like I was the only one who could do something, even though I had no idea what that something was. I started trying to track down anyone who might have been involved. I reached out to some contacts I had in the tech world, people who knew their way around the dark web, but no one could help me. Every lead I found was a dead end. The people running this operation were ghosts. They didn't leave a digital footprint and they didn't make mistakes. Weeks turned into months, and I was getting nowhere. I started to wonder if I'd ever find out what had happened to Lauren, or if I was just chasing shadows. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything else. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Imagined her trapped somewhere, alone and terrified. Then, one night, I got another email. It was from the same anonymous sender who had given me the link to the forum. This time, there was no message, just a video file attached. My hands were shaking as I clicked on it, terrified of what I was about to see. The video was short, maybe 2 minutes long. It was shot in a dark room, lit only by a single overhead light. In the center of the frame was a woman tied to a chair, blindfolded and gagged. She was struggling against the restraints, but she wasn't screaming. It was like she knew it wouldn't do any good. I recognized her immediately. It was Lauren. I watched in horror as the camera slowly zoomed in on her face. There was no sound, just the faint hum of the light above her. After a few seconds, the video cut to black. That was it. No explanation, no demands, just that single, horrifying image of her sitting there, helpless. I wanted to throw up. The video had been sent to me for a reason, but I didn't know what that reason was. Were they taunting me? Trying to scare me into giving up the case? Or were they trying to show me that she was still alive, that there was still hope? I tried to trace the video, to find out where it had come from, but there was nothing. It had been sent through the same encrypted service as the first email, and there was no way to track it. I was back to square one, with no idea where to go from there. I don't know how much time passed after that. Days, weeks. It all blurred together. I kept waiting for another email, another clue, but nothing came. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in this endless cycle of fear and helplessness. I wish I could say that I found Lauren, that I managed to save her from whatever nightmare she was trapped in. But the truth is, I never saw her again. The email stopped, the forum went offline, and I was left with nothing but questions and guilt. To this day, I don't know what happened to her. I don't know if she's still out there somewhere, or if she's gone forever. All I know is that I got too close to something I never should have found. And now I have to live with the knowledge that there are people out there who can make anyone disappear without leaving a trace. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.